So, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to today's episode. Today, you're going to be listening to our conversation with Sepideh, the Mission Director for USAID in Nepal. She has been in that role since August 2020, but before that, she's worked with different USAID missions. Some of the most notable one was with the Foreign Service in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Her biggest experience happens to be in supporting governance efforts, particularly institutional and organizational change. And we are so excited for you to listen to what we have for you today. I hope you enjoy and welcome. Maybe let's start us off with, I heard you did some field visits. How did that go for you in Nepal?
I've been doing, well, first of all, it's great to be here and doing this podcast because it's really great to be able to talk about stories of innovation in development that are a little bit different from how we generally think about innovation.
Yeah.
Because generally, I think we think about innovation as technology, and that's not all innovation obviously is. And it's great that you start by asking me about some of my field visits, because this is really where I see quite a bit of innovation all across Nepal, all across the country, that are possibly not reflected when we generally talk about development or when we talk about innovation in development. I do try to do quite a bit of travel all across Nepal. Over the weekend, I was in Province 1.
Nice.
Finally, I was in Japa and I was in Elam.
Yeah.
It was the final province. I've been to every province by now.
Yeah.
And it's just been really interesting to see the incredible diversity of Nepal in terms of terrain, in terms of the people, in terms of the culture, in terms of the practices, in terms of the way people live, in terms of the way people interact and react to each other, and obviously in terms of the level of development, in terms of the amount of resources that people have. So, I've been to, like I said, all the different provinces by now. I've been to Nepal Gunj quite a few times. I'm going back again sometime next month.
Yeah.
But it's, I think, an incredible way to learn. It's a great learning experience. It's also a great way to connect and to hear directly from these communities with whom we work, with whom we want to partner with whom we want to collaborate.
Exactly. It's interesting that you said you've been to Nepal Ganj a few times. Why? Why Nepal Ganj?
Why Nepal Gunj? It's because that is one of the areas where we have a lot of our USAID activities.
Okay.
We do quite a bit of work in that part of the country. What we do in USAID really runs across all of the different sectors. We do quite a bit of work in health. We do quite a bit of work in education. That's generally nationwide.
All right.
Then we do quite a bit of work in agriculture, and that's more private sector led. So we work with a lot of cooperatives. We work with private sector. We work directly with the communities. And, we obviously work a lot with civil society, with media. I'm sure I'm missing one of our sectors here. Our environment work, energy work. Yeah. And Nepal Gunj is one of those places where a lot of our work is concentrated, or we can get to that work from Nepal Gunj relatively pretty easily, given
so it's
the
nice
terrain.
And layered and interconnected as well.
Exactly.
One of the things that I enjoyed about Nepal Ganj, even though I haven't been there, but just the stories about it, it's also the food. Apparently it has really good biryani, but maybe you can tell us about that later.
Oh, well, I can talk about biryani all the time. I love biryani.
Okay.
But no offense to Nepal Gunj, but I have to say the best biryani I've had in Nepal was actually in Sudur Pashchim.
Ah.
Yes, they make it in this really nice clay pot. And it just has incredible flavor. So that was my favorite so far. Nepal Gunj is good too.
It's a nice way to see how some of the traditional practices and traditional values can still be carried forward into today's life. And it's interesting to see it in food, but also to see it in agricultural practices as well.
Exactly.
So let's talk a little bit about when you talked about innovation, not just being about high tech, because that's something that will resonate with a lot of people. So let's start with, what does innovation mean to you as Sepideh?
Innovation to me, especially within the context of the work I do and development, has a lot to do with the level and the types of perspectives, the processes, the way you do things, and how you are potentially starting to do those differently in a way that is more reflective and more responsive to what we are trying to do in development at this point in time. And this is part of what we've been doing in our USAID mission in Nepal. And this is also what our agency overall has been focusing on a lot more in the past couple of years. You know, we get used to doing things a certain way. We get used to going to a certain number of partners. We get used to working with a certain group of people. And we get used to doing that in a way that we've been doing them for a while. And we ultimately end up doing it at times without really thinking about it, because this just becomes our habit.
It's comfortable.
It's comfortable, exactly. And what we see is that may work for a certain amount of time, but as things change, as the context changes, as the world changes, as our interactions with each other and our expectations change, then you need to innovate. You need to think about different ways of doing things that is responsive to the time and to the people. And for me, that's what innovation in development means. It's bringing in perspectives and voices that we have not brought into the conversation before. It's making all the effort possible to put them in the lead and really listen to them. You know, one of the things I was thinking about as I was getting ready for this podcast was this example we give all the time of teach or give a man a fish and they will feed themselves. Teach a man to fish and they will feed their families. And then I started thinking about that and I thought, well, why are we teaching a man to fish? Because depending on where this man and hopefully a woman live, they probably know how to fish. What they may need are resources so they themselves can figure out how to do it better. Because if you live near a sea and you depend on fish, well, then obviously you need to be able to fish. And sometimes these communities know how to fish. They know how to do it in a way that is environmentally and culturally appropriate to them, but they may not have the type of resources to do it better. They may have ideas of how to do it better, but they may not be able to. So I think when we talk about perspectives, when you talk about innovation, it's how do you bring those perspectives and those ideas and those innovations that already exist in these communities and really build on those.
Well said. Before we talk a little bit about the programs, let's talk about the inclusion bit. You summarized it really well when you talk about we have to bring in the different voices and different perspectives. From your point of view, how do we do that? You might not have the best answer for sure, but just what would be your contribution to this topic? How do we bring in the different voices and make it meaningful?
We have to start by really rethinking our own role before we do that. We have to really start thinking of, what is our role in this? Again, for a long time, we have seen ourselves as development professionals. And what that has meant to us is that we are the ones who are the experts. We come in with these incredible technical expertise, and we go to these communities in these countries and we teach them. Again, that is the idea that we have come into the conversation with. We are here to teach you. We use words like beneficiaries. We use words like teach. We come with this particular context. And the first step in this is to really think about what is our role? What is it we're bringing in?
Yeah.
And what is it that these communities already bring in? What we've done is we've tried to rethink that. So we've gone from using the word beneficiary to using the word partner, because that's who they are. We don't use help or support. We say to collaborate, to cooperate, to co-create, to co-design. So it starts with changing your own perspective and changing your own mindset about what is your role in development. And what is the relationship that you have with these communities that you want to partner and collaborate with towards a common goal, either for that country or, frankly, at this point, as things are becoming more and more complicated, for the world overall. You know, we just had another COP, and we talk about climate change. We talk about food security. We talk about economic development. And we keep talking about the fact that we can't do this alone. No country can do this alone. No individual can do it alone. So then the question becomes, who are you listening to as you are developing these solutions? Who is sitting at that table? Who is within that space that you've created? Who is using this platform that we have this privilege to be able to share? So that's, I think for me, that's where it starts. And then doing the hard work of going into these communities, rethinking what your role is. You know, one of the things we talk about is rethinking our role from being experts to being facilitators, to being people who create space, expand the space, being people who are listeners more than talkers. And I think when you create that space, and when you listen, and when people feel comfortable speaking, then you can start picking at their ideas. Then you can still bringing them in and have them propose what the solution is. I think that's I think that answered your question, I hope.
No, it did. It did, because it also spoke to the USAID's approach when it comes to development work in Nepal, and that it's from a change of mindset perspective to how do we approach this co-creation process, coming up with solutions, which is then bringing me to the aspect of when we want to think about making the solutions and the products more equitable. What are some of the things that we can do together?
It goes along with what we were talking about before. If you want to be inclusive and if you want to be equitable, you have to try very hard to think about who you're reaching out to, who you're listening to, whose voices you are amplifying, whose voices you are bringing forth. And again, I think we can do a better job of that than we have been. The other part of it is thinking about who is going into these communities to have the conversations. Is the person who's going to this community to facilitate and to create the space someone who truly understands that community, who empathizes with that community, or is this someone who doesn't really understand them? So the other part of what we're trying to do is to focus on the extent to which we ourselves as development people, as a development agency, to the extent to which our staff is reflective of the communities that we want to work with, we want to partner with, we want to collaborate with. You know, like I said, I think we started the conversation with the concept that Nepal is an incredibly diverse country. Depending on whether you're in the Terai or in the hills or in the mountains, depending on if you're a man or a woman, depending on, you know, your educational background, you come with very different perspectives. And that's not all that different than in my own country in the US. If you are from the coastal cities, you come with a certain perspective. If you're from the middle of a country, you come from a certain perspective. If you're urban, if you're rural, if you're a man, if you're a woman, if you're Black, if you're white, if you're Hispanic. And so I think the perspective that we bring into the conversation is very much shaped by who we are and our experiences. And for us to do development well and to truly be inclusive and equitable, we need to bring people into the conversation that have this diversity of perspective, of background. And that is part of what we're trying to do here within USAID Nepal, but again, overall within our agency, to look at inclusive development, inclusive, equitable development. We have to start at home. Who is going into these communities to have the conversations, to listen to them? You know, you asked me about some of the places I've traveled. there are places I travel where Nepali is not spoken. There are a lot of places I've traveled where only the local languages are spoken. So if we take an interpreter who only knows Nepali, we lose the conversation. So we have to take someone with us, and we make an effort to make sure we know what local languages are spoken and have someone there who can talk to the local communities in their language, who can connect with them, and then who can let us know what was discussed.
I completely agree with that. And it's also similar to some of the experiences that we are having. For example, with World Vision, we are a child-focused organization. And so there are moments when we have to think about children as partners or children as central to the programs that we come up with, or the programs that we are, implementing and investing in. What are some of the roles that the children can play in this? And COVID, without a doubt, played a really big role in kind of jump-starting or restarting that conversation internally within World Vision, because we had to go through a process of discussing with the children, what are some of the challenges that you're facing right now? And it was, to some of them, it was just as simple as we miss interacting with our friends. We miss playing. We miss being out in the field. And we understand, as outside of the children's world, we understand why there were those restrictions, so that we don't have a widespread number of children that are infected with COVID, but we still needed to have another conversation with children. So from that perspective, it's interesting to see that marginalized groups, it can also be the hidden groups. Because sometimes you go to a community and you don't see a certain group of people, but it doesn't necessarily click that they're missing out on certain conversations.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about children.
Yeah.
We have an education program in USAID. It's mostly focused on primary education, grades 1 to 3. And we also focus on what we call Reading for All, which is intended to bring different types of learners, different types of children into the conversation. Those who have learning disabilities, who have physical disabilities that doesn't allow them to learn. And one of the things I have conversations with our education team very often is, are we asking the children, where is their voice? Children are incredibly smart. Sometimes they're a whole lot smarter than we are. And the same way, like you said, are we going to these communities and asking them, are we asking the children, how do they feel? Do they have any ideas? I mean, they come with a lot of very creative, innovative ideas. Are we listening to them? To what extent are we capturing what they know with regards to how they learn and what is missing in terms of how they learn? So that's one thing. And then in response to, or just touching on what you said about the communities, sometimes when I go to these communities, at least in the beginning, what I would see is that the community members were standing in the background. They weren't doing the talking. And others were doing the talking for them. And I would go into these communities and people would say, well, she is doing this, he is doing this, this is what is happening. To which my response was, well, okay, why are we speaking for them? They're standing right there. Let's bring them forward. Let's have a conversation directly with them. And two things happen when I realize I'm doing this. It takes them a while to start speaking, because what I found is that they're not always asked. They themselves are very used to being spoken for. So they stand in the background and someone says, well, he this or she this or they this. So in the beginning, they don't know what to say. And it takes a bit of effort for us to figure out how to ask the kind of questions that resonates with them. I also remember being at, I think this was either in Mugo or Jumla. And I remember sitting with a group of women farmers. We're sitting on the rooftop of one of them. I think there was about 15 or 16 of them sitting around. And we started having conversation. And at some point I asked a question like, how do you feel about something like this? And one of them said, don't ask me about how I feel. I can't answer something like that. Ask me very concrete questions, and then I will answer you. And I said, okay, great. Let me think through some concrete questions to ask you. There was another example. We were with this group of anti-poaching women community right outside of Aurora Lake. This was a few months ago. And again, we started wanting to have a conversation with them. And we started the conversation with the type of conversation we generally ask. Very vague, very conceptual. How is this going? How is that going? And again, the response is fine, good, great. And then we realized we really have to start asking questions in a very different way.
Yes.
Tell me about yourself. Tell me about your community. Tell me what you plant. Tell me how long you've lived here. And the more we went on in this conversation, the more we learned from them, because we realized what is their perspective? How do they think about things? And it was fascinating because it was a group of women who are focused on anti-poaching. So they are supposed to be helping their communities from poachers, from coming in, because we're trying to preserve the biodiversity of the plants and the animals in that area. The more we talked to them and the more time we spent with them, we realized that the work we have asked them to do is actually negatively impacting their economic well-being. Because these animals that they're supposed to protect are coming into their field and destroying their field. And there's nothing they can do about this because the laws protect
the animals.
The animals. So it's incredibly complicated. It's complex. And if you do not sit down with these communities and hear their perspective to the extent they need to be heard, we're losing a lot in terms of how we can do our work and how we all meet our common objectives, ours and those women's and their communities and their children and just everybody else in that is within that space.
Yeah, I'll want to come back to that later about complex challenges or complex situations because of how interlinked a lot of them are. So let's park that for a minute and let's talk about, based on all of your travels, what would you say, travels within Nepal, for example, what are some of the stories of change that you're seeing as a result of innovation? Or you can say that this is connected to innovation.
So I could talk about a few of them. Going back to where we started, in some ways, what we see our job is to expand the space so that others can come in and use their ideas to innovate. So some of the examples I can talk about are, again, I think it was in Nepal Gunj, going back to Nepal Gunj. We do a lot of work on agriculture. So one innovation that when I was there I saw are hybrid seeds. Because as the environment changes, as climate change brings more impact across the world, the way people were planting, the type of seeds they were planting is no longer going to work in that temperature at that time with that level of water, with that level of fertilizer. So we have to think about different types of seeds. They're hybrid. I think they call them climate smart, something along those lines.
Climate smart agriculture. Yeah.
Climate smart agriculture. So that's one type of innovation that we're working with communities in that area, with the private sector, to create these types of seeds that are more resilient to these changes in the environment. Another innovation, as I think we started to talk about COVID, and a lot of children, as we mentioned, were not going to school. So how do we work with children and with their teachers and with their families to help them, to support them, to partner with them so that they can continue to learn, even when they were not going to school? Another one, I think you could call it an innovation. Nepal just had elections. They had elections at the municipal level in May, I believe it was, and we just had it over the weekend. And we worked with a group of youth to do what they call My Vote, My Future. Again, USAID helped create the space, expand the space, where these young people came in and they created their own content and they put it out there to try to get out the vote and motivate people. So those are some of just the examples that come to mind.
And they're really important examples because it's not about intense technology and intense resources. It's using knowledge and using existing resources that is inherent in the people that we want to partner with to come up with the solution. So thank you for sharing that.
And actually, let me add, there were a couple of technology ones also, but again, they were very basic technology. So for example, our education team worked with their partners to, I believe it was an app. They created an app to help children who couldn't hear to work with sign language. Another one during COVID was to help the communities create apps so they could sell their products because they couldn't get around, they couldn't go door to door. So they created these apps. But again, these are basic technologies. These aren't these grand technologies that are transformational across the world, but these are small things that can potentially start small, help this and support the communities, and then perhaps, catalyze change for the communities, for these individuals, to maybe even do something better and bigger later. But you're right, it takes all different sizes and levels of technology and or non-technology innovation.
I agree. And one of the things that stands out for me with the examples that you've shared is that technology, actually no, not technology, the innovation stories that you've shared so far, it's helping to demonstrate how different people can participate at different levels. And it reminds me of something that someone told me, I forget who, when I was just starting out in my work, is that inclusion, for example, inclusion is to be invited to a dance, but participation is to be asked to dance. And now as we're talking, I'm wondering if, we might want to expound on it a little bit about being asked to dance. Is the music, the type of music you like? Do you have the right types of shoes? Because we are now talking about the resources that we inject into this space to bring about meaningful participation.
I think that's a great point, because the type of music you play could potentially exclude people. Like, okay, sure, show up to the dance. I will ask you to dance. But if I'm playing the waltz and you have no idea what the waltz is, you're not going to be able to dance. Or at least when you invite them, then make sure you have the resources to teach them to dance the waltz if they don't know what that is to start with. Especially
if they've demonstrated an interest in the waltz.
Exactly.
And guys, the waltz is an analogy. So, all right. Back to complex issues. So, for example, World Vision, we just put out, not just, but back in May, there was a child situation report, and we collaborated with the government on this. And while child labor is very much a protection issue, we are learning that it's difficult to separate it, for example, from livelihood issues. When we look at agriculture, the agriculture as is being practiced is very labor intensive. If we don't inject sustainable inputs into it, or in terms of tools or mechanizing agriculture. But at the same time, we share a long, porous border with India. So we have a lot of migration happening, particularly of the able-bodied youth. So the labor that would have been affordable to the farmers is migrating. The labor that is now available is child labor. But child labor is prohibited by law, but also by human rights. So how do we work out a solution around this? It's not enough to just say child labor is wrong, we must stop. It's also not enough to just mechanize agriculture, because again, mechanizing agriculture might make it inaccessible to some people in the community. So share your thoughts.
Yeah, good question. I wish I had a really good answer. To start, I would say, these questions are incredibly complex, and that's part of the issue and part of the challenge, so that we do have to understand the bigger context. I'll give you two examples that is actually very related to what you said. A group of us went to Sudur Pashim to look at our countering trafficking in persons programming. And again, the more we talked to the community, the more we realized this is very much a livelihood issue. Why do people leave? It's because they don't have the livelihoods. So you can put all the laws in place. You can close the border. You can put, you can criminalize all these things, but people will continue to go. And we talked to groups of people there who had left, who had been trafficked. They would come back, but then they would go again because there is this pull from these places where they can get jobs, and then there's this push of poverty that is taking them there. So as part of that trip, we went to another community where we've been partnering with to help them in their agricultural programs. And we talked to one person. I think we had given this person some heavy machinery. And this person was able to make a living by using that heavy machinery, and they didn't need to leave anymore. So making sure to connect or figuring out a way to connect these and providing to the extent you can, because integrated solutions are really, really difficult. Another area which I started talking about is in the area of environment and climate change. The example that I gave about the Rara Lake, where these women were in charge of anti-poaching, yet their efforts was actually hurting them economically. This isn't just that community. It's pretty much all around the world. We have come to a point in our, on our current time on Earth where our actions up to now have created this environment of climate change, which is impacting a lot of people. So as a world community, we're trying to address that issue. And so we're putting all these practices in place of do this, don't do this. But what is also happening is that a lot of people who have already been impacted by climate change in a negative way are now also going to be those that are most impacted by our efforts to address climate change and the decrease in biodiversity. And so we need to really think about these things. So I guess my short answer is I don't really have a good answer. But our role, and I think our responsibility, is to keep thinking about these things, to keep asking these really difficult questions, to keep expanding our own perspective. And again, going back to what we said about equitable, inclusive development, to think really hard about who is part of this conversation, who is part of creating these solutions. So are these women who are in Rara Lake, have they been consulted? When we think of these great thoughts about how to address these issues, are the people in these communities consulted? Are they brought into the conversation? When we talk about clean energy, when we talk about hydropower, for example, what happens to the communities who are living next to these bodies of water, who is potentially going to have their rivers diverted, who are not going to be able to access the fish that was in this river? So, I don't necessarily have the answer, but maybe I should not be the one who comes up with the answer. And again, this is the whole point of how we're trying to do things very differently. It shouldn't be me answering for these communities. It should be all of us coming together and saying, okay, this is how it's impacting me, but I have no idea how this is going to impact you. Sure, hydropower is great in the long term for all of us, but what does that mean for you? How do you feel about this? How is it going to impact you? What is your voice in this? How do we work with you to also make sure you're not negatively impacted yet again with all these solutions that we are putting forward?
And that is very, very important. I feel like a little bit like you're underselling yourself in terms of saying you don't know what the answer is, but I think that's very important in terms of just a challenge to us all and the listeners, all of us who've been acting in this space or who intend to act in this space, that we must rethink how we do things. The process matters. Mm-hmm. The process that we've been doing up to this point have only gotten us to a certain stage. But if we want to advance, if we want to have sustainable results, then it's about time that we rethink how we go about these things. So once again, thank you. Really thank you for sharing that.
And I mean, just one thing I would say, we talk about the word humility a lot, but we don't take it seriously. I think this is, and I don't necessarily think I am underselling myself, but although I appreciate that. But I think it takes coming into the conversation and into the challenge with humility on our part and giving ourselves a little bit less credit than we have in the past, and a little bit more or a lot more credit to those who we have not brought into the conversation. Because I think ultimately we know a lot less than we think we do, and these communities know a whole lot more than we have given them credit for in terms of coming up with defining their own challenges and coming up with their own solutions.
As the world continues to change, climate change is here with us. It'll continue to be with us. COVID was just another reminder that sometimes you're a heartbeat away from a pandemic or a crippling disease outbreak. But then we also have the refugee crisis. We live in a country that is very prone to hazards and multiple risks. What can we do to stay more agile and responsive?
That works probably at two different levels. One level is what we've talked about already. Part of it has to do with who we are, how self-aware we are, what's our perspective, who are you bringing into the conversation. There is another part of it which has to do with our organizations and with our processes and just how do we do business. And that part also needs to be taken into consideration. A lot of our organizations who have taken the responsibility for this type of work, U.S. government, USAID, all of us, are part of large organizations. And large organizations sometimes could be more agile. And again, one thing I have been very happy to see, at least within my organization, is this is something we're very much focused on. How do we work in a way within our organizations, within our rules and regulations and what is expected of us, in a way that allows us to react more quickly and become more responsive. I spent quite a bit of my career working on Afghanistan. I served there twice. I've served in a few other countries where it's been more of these complex type of work where very quick action is needed. And I think we've learned a lot in the past couple of decades about how our organizations work and where we need to be streamlined, where decisions need to be streamlined, where responses need to be done more quickly. We have for example, we have our Bureau of Humanitarian Affairs within USAID, who just is much more responsive. When the earthquake happened here, they're the ones who jumped in. When there's monsoons, they're the ones who support. And part of what we've been talking about is in those places where more urgent action is needed, which frankly, like you said, is becoming everywhere. This isn't just the earthquakes and the monsoons. Now we have the food security issue as a result of, Russia's war in Ukraine. We had COVID for the past 2 years and it's still with us. What we're realizing is that these situations that were the earthquakes and monsoons are no longer the exception. Everything is becoming an emergency that requires much more quick action. So it has been a challenge for us. I think all of our organizations that were built at a certain time around a certain context and for a certain purpose have had to react and respond. And again, I think this also goes back to this entire conversation is how are we innovating within our organizations? How are we becoming creative within our organizations in terms of how we do things? And for me, all of this conversation, more and more as I think through this, becomes, we very often talk about the what is important. And more, as I think through this, the how becomes just as, or very often even more important. Okay. And you hear a lot people saying the process is the product. I'm not sure that's simplifying things, but process becomes really important, because the process you create determines how fast you are able to respond. It determines who you are bringing in to respond. Again, who is included? Are they included equitably? Are their voices heard? Are their ideas brought in? How are we reacting? Because it's not enough just to bring in their voices. Are you hearing them? Are you taking those ideas and actually incorporating them into the solutions you are putting together? So again, I think as organizations, this is something that is obviously a challenge. I think many of us are focused on that. We definitely are focused on it at USAID. We're very much focused on it at USAID Nepal. And we'll see where that goes. Hopefully to a really, really good place.
Hopefully, yeah. Which opens the door to localization, for example, because a lot of the time it's the local organizations that are going to be at the forefront of the disaster. But sometimes they don't have, because earlier on we were talking about the resources. Sometimes they don't have the resources that they need to be able to respond, maybe, shall I say, holistically, to the emerging needs or the diverse needs of the communities that have been affected by the disaster. So we are seeing that when we think about the localization overarching goal, we also have to rethink the different roles that we can play in terms of advancing localization. There's no question.
Oh, okay. Good. I agree with you. Exactly. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, more of a reflection aspect on that.
Yeah. I mean, and again, these are really good reflections, because this is what we spend a lot of our time thinking about.
Yeah.
And I think these are a lot of things we should be thinking about if we, again, want to innovate and do things in a different way and bring in all these different perspectives and bringing these creative ideas into our work.
But I have a different question. When we think about, for example, for World Vision, when we are innovating processes, it's something that we can do a lot more comfortably in-house, internally, as well as together with the community. But when we need to come up with products or solutions to the pressing challenges that we are facing together, we typically have to bring in what we are calling the non-traditional actors when it comes to development. So for example, I think it was 2 years ago when we came up with Kitab Bazaar. It's basically a platform that brings together schools and book publishers. We had to work with, or it was important that we worked with a private sector company, not only for an efficient product, but also for sustainability of the product. So it makes me think about how else can we bring in some of the non-traditional actors into this space, because we are seeing that we can't just think about sustainable goals. We have to start by thinking about sustainable inputs and then sustainable results to give us the sustainable development goals that we aspire for.
I would start by saying that these are non-traditional actors because we just haven't included them.
Yeah.
Not because they didn't have a role to play before. It's because I think they always had a role to play. But we've been evolving our own way of doing things. So again, working with the private sector, bringing them in as our true partners. I think we've realized, wow, okay, we really do need to work with the private sector. Our agriculture programs started with, us going in, the government going in, and they supporting, and then development partners going in, and they just helping them do the type of work that they do. But the work that we do in the agriculture sector here in Nepal, we call it private sector-led, because they are engaged from the very beginning. So the cooperative working with, these companies that are creating these hybrid seeds, working with the rice mills, working with the traders, with all of that, working with banks, making sure that the banks are connected so that these farmers, many of whom are actually women, are getting the type of credit that they need.
Yeah.
Working with companies who produce these machines or rent these machines or sell these machines. One of the things we did is a lot of the women, for example, because, like we said, a lot of the farmers are women. A lot of them are poor women. They can't really afford to buy the type of machines that they need to improve their productivity. So they can do a few things. One of them is, okay, if we can connect them to a bank that can provide them a low interest loan and subsidize these loans, then they can potentially buy these. The other thing is, well, they can rent these, or they can actually hire people who have these machines, own these machines, and bring them in. This is all private sector.
Yes.
The person who owns the machines and hires himself out is the private sector. The bank is a private sector. These, we call them agrovets. These are these, I guess they're these stores sort of things where they sell the seed, they sell the fertilizer, they rent the machines, and they work with these cooperatives, they work with the farmers, they teach them some of the things they need to learn. So we call them non-traditional, but perhaps now that we are bringing them in, they will become part of our just traditional way of working and group of people that we need to be working with.
Awesome. What would be your parting shot, because we've come to the end
My
of
parting
our
shot.
conversation? Yeah.
Well, maybe this would actually be a good parting shot because, again, I was thinking about this a little bit, what innovation means and why are we doing the type of thing we're doing. So as I was thinking about some of these, I started thinking about my own father. So I grew up in Iran. And my father was, and I actually come from a community that is underrepresented. And I remember growing up in Iran, and my father had 1,000 ideas. Like, he was constantly thinking about new, better ways of doing everything. He was incredibly handy. He would come up with these innovations and these creations. And what I realized as I was thinking about this is he was never able to put his ideas forward. He was never able to find the space or the platform to take these ideas, or at least try them. Maybe 90% of them would have probably failed. But I would think that maybe 5% of his ideas would have actually created something good for his community. And he didn't have that option. He wasn't given the space, he wasn't given the platform, he wasn't given the resources. And when I think about the work we're trying to do here, in Nepal, in USAID, when we talk about inclusion, when we talk about equity, when we talk about creating the spaces, when we talk about innovation, creation, in some ways, that's who I realized we're talking about. People like my father, who would have probably been able to do a lot more good for their communities where he grew up in Iran, if someone came and said, tell me about your ideas. Let's figure it out. Let's try it out. Let's see if we can actually take it somewhere. And so I hadn't realized until when I was thinking about some of these this morning that we're talking about people like my father.
Oh, thank you very much for sharing.